Welcome to Women Don't Do That, where we empower you with inspiration, knowledge, and skills to redefine your boundaries and unleash your potential. I'm Stephanie Minton, founder and CEO of Beacon North Strategies and your guide. Small town girl turned CEO while navigating career, motherhood, ADHD, and chronic migraines. Our conversations range from interviews with visionary women to solo episodes filled with actionable insights. We are your hub for turning what ifs into let's go. Are you ready to redefine your possible? Let's get started. I'm so excited to welcome today's guest. The Honourable Kathleen Wynne was Ontario's 25th Premier, my home province, first elected in the Ontario Legislature in 2003 as the MPP for Don Valley West. She became the leader of the Ontario Liberal Party in January 2013. Before becoming Premier, Kathleen held several ministerial positions. She's also been a trailblazer with many significant firsts, which we'll discuss today. Prior to her time as MPP, she served as a public school trustee in Toronto, among other important roles that we'll touch on. Let's just say she's kind of a big deal. I couldn't be more excited to welcome today's guest. So welcome to the Honourable Kathleen Wynne.
Thank you, Stephanie. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I wanted to start off by sharing with you a bit of a story. When you were doing the No Second Chances podcast and you came to Ottawa and did those events, I actually met you. And I don't know if you remember this, but I was working at the time with an organization that works with young kids interested in politics. And I had a group of young girls there.
Okay.
And you had
when we were at the
spoken with them in
hotel
hall.
there.
Yes, you had spoken to them in the hall, and think it was you that maybe even allowed them to ask a question from the stage, and then afterwards took a picture with them. And one of them was my daughter, and for years she had this picture of all of you on her bulletin board.
Oh my goodness.
And just wanted to share. I know for you, like those moments probably come really quick, but how they can stick with people for so long afterwards and the impact that you make.
I love that. I love that young girls saw all those women politicians together. I just think that it was a great event.
Yes.
And it was a great story that was being told.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's so true, because when you think about even when you were a kid, you wouldn't have had that kind of room full of premiers and first ministers to look to, right? And so it just speaks to how much things have changed, and still work left to be done, but a lot's been done as well.
How old's your daughter now?
She's 13.
Oh, that's fantastic. So she's about to go into high school.
Yeah, one more year and then she'll be in high school. That's right. And I have an 11-year-old. So.
Oh, that's great. Well, wish them luck.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
I want to kick things off there's two questions we ask every guest, trying to get to know them a little bit better. So what does life look like for you right now?
So life has a bunch of different pieces, none of them coordinated. I have to say, I used to call it learned dependency. I got very dependent on my staff because I, try to put a lot into a day. Anyway, so I'm teaching a course at U of T, both in the fall and in January, on public policy. So I just started in September this year with a first-year course, and then in January I'll teach a fourth-year course. So that's one day a week, and then the marking and so on. So I'm on two boards. One is the foundation board of the Kenora Chiefs Advisory in Northwestern Ontario, and I'm also on the Simcoe Greenbelt Coalition board. And I also do some work with a board in Six Nations. They're building the Woodland Cultural Center. So I have some board work. All volunteer board work, and I've got 6 grandchildren. So that's the other part of this. My youngest child 3 years ago had her daughter, and then 16 months ago had twin boys.
Wow.
So they're very, very busy, and so I divide my time among those passions.
Yes. Yeah, as soon as you said twins, I'm like, oh my, they definitely would need some extra hands, that's for sure.
Goodness. Yeah. Well, my daughter's a nurse. She's just gone back to work, and her husband's a prof, so she does shift work. And so my partner Jane and I we fill the gaps when they're both at work. So
yes. Oh,
anyway,
that's wonderful.
It's a blessing. Yeah.
Yes. So the other question we ask is what motivates you to live your best life?
So yeah, that's a big question.
Hmm.
Because I think, my inner energy and my motivation for life comes from a long, long time ago, from when I
Mm,
was a little kid. I grew up in a family where I had a mom who was always involved in the community. She was a singer, but then when she had her kids, she became a full-time mom and then a community activist, and then she became a play therapist. And my dad was a small town doctor. So we were very much in the community, and what I saw was problem solving. So,
mm,
for example, my dad had patients in a long-term care, a nursing home, it would have been called in those days.
mhm,
And so this is in the 60s and 70s, right? And he came home one day to my mom and he said, I heard some kids, because there were some kids with brain injuries
mhm,
and cerebral palsy and so on in this long-term care facility. And he came home and he said to my mom, I heard some kids singing at the villa, is what it was called, and I think they had pretty good voices. So out of that interaction, my mom, who had a friend who was a pianist, they created a group called the Villatones. These were 4 or 5 young people who were confined to wheelchairs, and she would go out once or twice a week, and she would practice with them. She took my baby sister with her and put her in a playpen at the nursing home, and they developed into this group called the Villatones, and they traveled the province. They raised money for a van. Anyway, all to say that I think that my view of the world was formed by living in a home where, well, if there's something that needs to be done, then
mm,
we have to do it. My parents were also involved, for example, in the 60s in setting up a youth drop-in center. There were kids who were
mm,
searching in the 60s, and there was some drug use and so on, and it was called the Youth Aid Center, and she worked with community people to do that. So I think that's where it started,
mhm,
because I, I just saw I just saw people who felt that there was a responsibility
mhm,
to help and fix what was not working around them, and that it wasn't done in a preachy or kind of paternalistic way. It was
mhm,
just like, we're here, we've got these resources, so we need to try to fix it. My grandmother also, so I don't usually talk about faith and politics or faith and activism, but I grew up in the United Church. My grandmother was a very active member of the United Church. And there was definitely a sense of that social gospel, that
mm,
um, and that's why I stayed in the United Church, that because it was and is primarily a place where social justice kind of
mm,
guides the mentality. And so I feel that was part of my upbringing as well. And my grandmother was an
mhm.
important person to me.
I love how you shared that and actually feel like in my own life had very similar synergies to that. And I often think about it, it's like this life of service that you should and want to find ways to help others.
Mm-hmm.
And it's innate, I find for myself, like it's hard to stop it sometimes, right? Because like you just want to give and yeah.
Well, that is a challenge. And I will just say to you, as a younger woman, you also have to look after yourself,
Hmm.
because there is always something that needs to be done.
Yes.
And you can get taken up by all the things around you. And people ask me, and did ask me through my political life, how do you manage life and work,
Mm.
the work-life balance? And I said, I am the wrong person to ask.
Yeah.
I don't know how to do that.
Yeah.
So you got to find somebody else to ask. I don't
Yeah.
have good limits around that.
Yes, I often say for me, it's a lifelong journey. Like I'm constantly working at being better at it, but I just feel like because some of that's so innate in me, it will be a lifelong journey of learning and trying to continue to work on that aspect because yeah,
Mm.
it's for some of us it's quite hard.
Yeah, and that's not to say that we're better than anybody else. It's just to
No.
say that we have this compulsion to be out there and fixing things. And sometimes, and I speak for myself, I've tried to fix things that aren't broken, and my kids will tell you, like, Mom, back off,
Yeah.
like they've
Yeah.
had to say that to me. Like, you stay out of that. That's not for you, especially when they were in school. And, I was super mom trying to
Yes.
solve every problem that not their problems, but the school's problems,
Right.
Anyway, that's a
Yes.
big conversation. So just look after yourself. I guess that's
Yeah.
my
Yeah. No,
message.
that's really important. When you talk about, especially with the school system piece, I'm not surprised that you would be engaged because of some of the work that you did, being a trustee and other things that you did in the school as well. Can you walk us through what are the Coles notes that take you from, your early career to becoming premier?
So I had a short career in academia. I did a couple of master's degrees, and I thought that my trajectory was maybe in academia. I had done a master's of linguistics, and so I thought maybe. But what happened was, when I had my three kids, two of
Hmm.
them were born in Holland. I lived in Holland for 3 years, and then the third one was born in Ontario. And I was involved in their lives. I was working part-time, and what happened was, I got very involved in education politics locally.
Hmm.
And, I was on the school council, and I served on committees of the Board of Education. I came out when I was 37. So I was working in the area of equity and
Hmm.
education against homophobia, that kind of thing. All that to say, I was very involved, and I thought, maybe one day I'd like to be a school trustee. And I ran in 1994. I lost that election. But then in 1995, Doug Ford was elected as the Premier of Ontario. And the agenda of that government was to defund a lot of the services that I believed were part of the social contract in Ontario. So whether it was some of the healthcare funding or education funding, there was billions of dollars taken out of those public services. And that is what motivated me. That's
Hmm.
actually what got me involved in provincial politics, because I think otherwise, if that had not happened, I think I would have stayed in local politics. I would
Hmm.
have run for school trustee again, which I did anyway, but it was under different circumstances. I might have been a city councillor, but I probably would have stayed at the school board. But because the changes that were made by the provincial government at that time meant that the provincial government had sole control over the funding of education,
Hmm.
I felt that I needed to be at that level. So it was really publicly funded education that got me into provincial politics. I think that's the
Right.
Coles notes. Yeah.
Right. Which
Yeah.
aligns obviously so well with being in provincial politics because of that responsibility for education.
That
Uh,
was always the level that I wanted to stay at. I remember at one point, John Godfrey, who was the federal member in the riding that I represented provincially, he retired. And people called me and said, are you going to go for a promotion and try to run federally? I said, I mean, I don't see it as a promotion, because the issues that I am really concerned about, healthcare, education, municipal governance, those are things that are the provincial responsibilities. So
right.
that's why I stayed there. Yeah.
One of the things that was really interesting, knowing that I was going to be interviewing you, is I was asking some different women, what kind of questions that they would have for you. So people are very curious, which is very, very interesting.
Thanks.
And one of the things that one of them wanted me to ask was, when you look at a career like yours, was there a lot of planning, or was lots of it leaning into unexpected opportunities? Like, what did that look like?
It was the latter. It was leaning
Mhm.
into opportunities. I always say to young people, it's good to have a plan. And one of the things Hazel McCallion said to me just before, Hazel McCallion, the longtime mayor of Mississauga, she died when she was nearly 102. And I talked to her just a few days before she died, and she said, tell your class they've got to have a plan. And having a plan is really important. Are you going to get an education? What do you think you might like to do? But at the same time, you have to be open to doors that will open as you go along. I had planned to be a teacher.
Mhm.
1976, I was in arts and science. 1976 at Queen's. I graduated in 1977. Whole checkered career, never mind. But there were no jobs. There were no teaching
Mm.
jobs. And so going to teachers college felt like a really frustrating option for me. And
Mm.
so I went on a different path, and kids will ask me, did you think you were going to be premier when you were in grade 8? Not in a million years.
Yes,
Not in
yeah.
a million years. I knew I was interested in politics, and we had a mock parliament in grade 8, but I didn't think I was qualified to be premier, and there were no role models, as we've talked about.
Hmm.
There were no women in first minister's roles when I
Right.
was in elementary school. So I always looked for the next thing that was going to allow me to grow, because I felt very strongly that I did want to grow and I wanted different experiences. I became a community mediator in the 90s when my kids were little, because it was something I could do part-time, and I worked in schools around the province. And being with my kids, doing something that allowed me to be with my kids was important to me. So
Mm.
um, I didn't immediately leap into a very full-time. I was privileged enough that I didn't have to do that. I could work
Mhm.
part-time until I worked full-time. And so, yeah, for me, it was watching for those doors to open, listening to the people around me, gathering people around me, spending time with people who I was interested in and who were doing interesting things. And together we did some interesting things together.
Amazing. I love how you shared how you worked part-time when your kids were little, because lots of women want to do that
I
or
know.
even take some time off, and makes them very nervous about their future and how do you balance all of those things. And I think it's a really interesting story that you were able to work part-time part of your career and still end up the premier of a province, and what a big job that is, and that was
Mhm.
part of your story, I think is really important.
Well, and it means that that path that I took has meant that I didn't earn as much money as some of my peers.
Mm,
Had I taken a different path, I would have accumulated more wealth. I am fine. I am not in any way complaining. I'm a privileged person, but that's the reality.
mm,
That's the sacrifice.
right.
And that was okay by me. When it came time for me to work full time, and I did. Before my third child was born, I did work full time at Humber College. I was teaching language skills. But then when she was born, I had 3 kids under 4,
Yeah.
and it was a lot. And I
Mhm.
just my husband at the time and he was working really, really full time. And so we just made a decision. And as I said, we didn't live in as big a house at the beginning. We didn't have the same kind of material wealth that I remember I had an envelope in the kitchen, and I have the money for gas, the money for groceries, the money for, all the things that we needed in a month. And the cash would go into that envelope, and when it was gone, it was gone. And
Right.
so that was,
Yes.
I had to manage that. And again, I'm not complaining in any way. It's just that was the reality.
Right.
I worry a little bit right now
Hmm.
that there are young women, young men who would like to have a different balance of family and work.
Hmm.
And because of the financial demands right
Yeah.
now, housing and so on. Now, we had high interest rates when we bought our house in 1981,
Yes.
but the price of the house was like $168,000.
Right.
Again, we weren't, Phil wasn't earning as much, but still, the financial demands right now are
Hmm.
huge, and the
Yes.
expectations are huge. So I
Yes.
think I think it's a different time, and it's something we need to look at as a society.
Yes. Yeah. It's something that certainly you hear more and more women
Yeah,
talking about that, right? Because we want there to be choice, and there isn't a lot of choice because
yeah.
everybody's really needs to be working full time, and like you said, things are so expensive.
Yeah.
When you look at your career as premier, what is one of the initiatives that you worked on for people of Ontario that you're the most proud of?
Well, there's so many things. I think that in answer to that question, I usually start with, as an MPP for 20 years and nearly 20 years, and as a school trustee. So I was in elected office for 22 years. The most important things I did were with individual families, helping them to navigate their lives.
Right.
Somebody who was looking for a better situation for their child, or who was looking for housing. Not that we could always succeed, but sometimes we could help. So those were the really important human connections. I am very proud of the fact that I was the Minister of Education who implemented full day kindergarten.
Right. Yeah.
Dalton McGuinty was the Premier, and I worked with Charles Pascal and Dalton, and we put in place full day kindergarten in this province, which is, I think, a terrific program for young families and for kids. I think it sets us apart from a lot of jurisdictions in the world, particularly in North America, that don't have it. So I'm very, very proud of that. When I was Premier, I'm really proud of the work we did in poverty reduction, whether it's minimum wage or the basic income pilot that we put in place. I think that those were, even though, Doug Ford canceled the basic income pilot, it is something that has added to the literature about basic income. And the more we deal with inadequate wages that people are earning and the realities of poverty increasing, I think the more important the data that was gathered from, and the stories that were gathered from the basic income pilot are very, very important. So I could go on, but we put money into the violence against women sector that hadn't seen an influx for 30 years. We changed labor laws that gave more support to workers in the workplace. Again, some of those were repealed, but some of them were put back as well. So
Right.
yeah, I'm very there are a lot of things that we did that continued the foundation that had been built by Dalton.
Right. The fall courses of the Beacon North Mentorship Academy are here. Join us to boost your advocacy, communication, and media skills. Whether you're new to lobbying or a seasoned advocate, we've got something for everyone. Check out the schedule and secure your spot today. Link in bio for details. How do you, when you talk about different policies or initiatives or things getting appealed over time or repealed by different governments when governments change, how do you navigate that? Because it's so hard, right? Some of those things take years to develop. Their policies that you really believe in, and then to have someone else change them or cancel them. What does that look like?
Well, it's very hard, but what I believe is that you never go all the way back. So, we ran in 2018 on a platform of universal childcare. We lost that election; it didn't happen. But we had been building childcare spaces. Our goal was 100,000 childcare spaces. We had been building those childcare spaces, which meant that when the federal government, just in the last few years, brought in childcare. Now, it's not going that well in Ontario, so I'm not singing the praises right now of the provincial government. But the fact is that the progress that we made on building spaces has meant that, at least to some extent, we've been able to, in the province of Ontario, build that $10 a day childcare system. Yes. And if we hadn't done that work, then that wouldn't have happened. The early years centers, that exist around the province, we increased the number of those. We put more supports in place. Those are fantastic places for young families, and that did not get repealed. So, to my point, you don't ever go all the way back.
Yes.
When we raised the minimum wage was not reduced, right? We raised it to $14 an hour. And so, yes, the new government didn't raise it to 15 right away, but at least, and I think of this when I go into the grocery store and, women working at the cash desk, at least their salary is better than it would have been if we had left it at $11.69 or whatever it was, So,
yes.
So I kind of, maybe it's a rationalization, but I think that we make small steps and we clean the air by shutting the coal-fired plants. Nobody's going to open those coal-fired plants again. Maybe they're not going to do everything we would do in renewable energy, but Dalton McGuinty cleaned the air in this province, and that will stand as a legacy. So that's how I think about government and why it's worth doing it.
I think it's an important perspective, and actually something that you can carry through to many areas of your life, right? Like whether
Yeah.
you're a CEO or a principal, or you sell your company to someone else, or your child takes over, all of those transitions
Yeah.
will have to deal with the types of things that you did. And for some of the questions that I'm asking you, that's part of what I'm interested in is even though you were the premier of a province, some of the things that you've went through, the types of decisions that you have had to make are different, some obviously in scale, but are some of the types of things that the women listeners are trying to navigate as well. And I find that very interesting.
Yeah, and I think that that notion of building a strong foundation so that whatever
Mm,
comes next can use that and doesn't have to, doesn't have whoever those people are or the government is, they don't have to go back to square one, that actually the foundation, the bones of the organization are good. And as you say, that can apply to a company, it can apply to a family, whatever it is. Build in strength and resilience, and
mm,
then you can watch, you can watch what happens next. Some of it you'll love and some of it you'll hate. At least you did your best to build
yes,
that strong foundation. And that's,
yes,
at the end of the day, you only can do your best, and
yes.
then history
And
will judge.
yes, and on top of that, I think it's important to think about the context at the time too, because you're making decisions, whether it's, again, in different roles or as the premier, that with the best information that you had at the time,
Exactly,
where
exactly.
maybe there's new research or things have really changed now, but at the time you worked through the best advice that you could and the best that you could
Yeah,
with the province at the
I have a great
time.
example of that. So when I lost the election in 2018, I stayed in the legislature. I didn't lose my seat, and so I stayed. And so one of the things you can do as an MPP is you can bring private members' bills. And so I brought a private members' bill that called for, based on new research, the implementation of seat belts in all school buses across the province.
Mm.
And, I got a lot of flack from the other side of the floor because they said, you were the Minister of Transportation. Why didn't you do that? And I can tell you, when I was Minister of Transportation, I asked that question over and over again. Why don't we have seatbelts in school buses? And every single time I asked, the research that came forward to me was that it was more dangerous to bolt the kids in because the school buses were built in a way that would protect them. Whatever. I kind of didn't believe it, but that was what came back to me. And
Mm.
then there was new research after 2018
Mm.
that demonstrated that there had been a report that had gone to Transportation Canada, and actually there was an argument for seat belts. Anyway, but I can honestly say to you that I made the best decision that I
Yes.
could given the information that I had. And that is all I think we can ask of ourselves.
Hmm. What does what does that look like for you when you've been the premier and then you continue to sit afterwards? Because we see that different times. Stephen Harper stayed for a little bit after
Mm-hmm.
the government transition. How do you make that decision, and what does that look like?
Mm-hmm. So there were a lot of people who were saying to me after that 2018 loss, you should just leave. You don't need to stay. And so I thought about it a lot, not for a long time, but I had to think about it deeply. The reasons I stayed were these. I had won in my riding in a sweep that went the other way. So when the province was going conservative in my riding,
Mm,
I was elected as a liberal. And I felt that I had a really strong obligation to the people who had elected me in 2003. They re-elected me in 2018, and I felt strongly that I needed to stay. I also felt strongly that because I wasn't going to be the leader anymore, because I did step down from the leadership on the night of the election. I needed to stay and be part of that team that rebuilt, because we were tiny, there were 7 of us,
mm,
and John Fraser became the interim leader. And over those 4 years, it was a very healing process for those of
mm,
us who had felt so devastated on that night in June of 2018.
mhm,
It was a healing process for us to be there, to be taking on the policies of the government, to be raising our voices, in the interests of our communities, and doing what MPPs do. Because whether you're the premier or whether you're a backbench MPP, you have a job to do for your constituents. And those 4 years allowed me to kind of reconnect with that, because in 2003, when I ran for office, I didn't run to be the premier. I ran to be the MPP for Don Valley West. And I kind of went full circle back to that. So that's why I stayed.
That's really important. And, you know, politics changes so frequently. And so there's so much unprediction in what can happen. I work in government relations, and so it's so interesting because clients always want to know, and I'm like, well, Justin Trudeau doesn't know, so why should I know? Like, he hasn't decided yet about some of the big decisions that he needs to make. And when we look at even the Liberal Party federally, we look at what's happening with Justin Trudeau, and decisions like these things are so challenging. They're nuanced, and like what you went through in some of those decisions, they repeat themselves over time.
Absolutely.
And whether it's, politics with what's happening now or just people's private lives, what advice would you give people when they're navigating those really big decisions?
Well, I think that it's really important not to jump into a decision on those big issues. You may have a gut response, and you may actually go that way. But I think it's really valuable to take some time and figure out who are the most trusted people on that particular issue. So I had to talk to Jane. My family had to be supportive of what I was doing, whether it was getting into politics or getting out of politics. And Jane was the key person that I had to be able to look her in the eye and say, this is why I'm doing it. And it had to make sense to her. If it didn't make sense to her, then it wasn't going to work.
Right.
So, so I think having those trusted people around you is the most important thing. And then, so you need to take some time. And then I guess just kind of trying to envision what you want to do. Are you doing it because you feel it's just an obligation to other people, or is there actually something that you want to do in that time or in that role? Because if there's not, it's going to pale really quickly, and you're going to be looking around for something else. So to make a commitment like that, I think you have to envision what it is you want to do, and then step into it, and then step into it with all your heart, and not second guess yourself, because the thing is, with these big decisions, there are always so many voices. Oh, you should do this, you should do that. Another example.
Everybody's got an opinion.
Everybody's got an opinion. So in 2007, John Tory, who was the leader of the provincial Conservatives, decided he was going to run against me in my riding of Don Valley West. I had to decide whether I was going to run, because leaders always beat non-leaders. That was historically that's what happens. Or whether I was going to look for another riding, or whether I was going to get out altogether. And so I took some time. There were lots of people saying to me, you should go to another riding. Oh, he's going to beat you. You got to, step down. And then there were voices saying, you stay. And if you lose, you go down with dignity, And so that's what I decided to do. I really decided I was going to win, but I decided that I was going to stay. And I knew that the chances were not great. And this is another piece. I had a plan B. So Jane and I talked about, if we didn't win the election, then we would do something we'd been talking about for a long time, and we would go away for a while, and we would try to live somewhere else for a period of time. Anyway, that plan didn't get activated because I did win. But having the plan B, particularly in politics, but I think in lots of these risky situations in life, having something that means that you're not desperate. And your life won't be over if this thing doesn't happen, right? And I think that's important, because you can't count on life delivering what you want necessarily.
No, and I think that's great advice. I've heard a lot of MPs and stuff that enter retirement talk about that, how it's such an all-encompassing life. And yes, it's about the person, but a lot of the time the importance comes from the role, and then all of a sudden you're out of this role,
Yeah.
and having something, it doesn't necessarily have to be full time, but something to do, going from that to nothing, a lot of them, from what I understand, it's very challenging on your mental health,
Yeah. And
so.
especially people, I worry about people who don't have family or who haven't
Mm,
or who have gone in very young. When you go into politics as a very young person, there are people in the Ontario legislature. There's one guy who's been there since he was 19.
right.
And I
Yeah.
just think, you know what? Maybe you need to figure out what life experiences you want to get so that you've got something to fall back on, because at some point this political career is going to come to an end one way or another, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. When you look at, it could be professionally or personally, are there things you wish you had done differently?
There are always things
Mm.
that the what ifs, right?
Yes, yes.
Um, what if I had pursued a PhD? What if I
Mm,
had become a linguist and become a professor? What path would that have taken me down? What if I had applied to law school? Would that have set me up better to be a politician? What if I had gone into politics earlier? I think about that a lot.
mm,
I
mhm,
didn't become a school trustee till I was 47, and I
right.
became an MPP when I was 50. So, the good thing about that was I experienced to the was rich and good, but if I'd started earlier, then I would have had, it would have been a different experience and I would have done things differently afterwards. So those are the kinds of things those are the kinds of exercises but honestly, I'm 71 and I really feel how short life is now.
Mm,
And so I don't dwell on those things. I think about my life and I think about the things I've done and I try to do things like this to share my experience
mm,
for people who have questions because I feel like
yes,
that's my job.
yes.
But I don't spend a lot of time wringing my hands about the things I could have done because coulda, shoulda, woulda.
Yes, yeah, no, it's very true. When you look about, or when you look at a role like you had, you're preparing for premier, new opportunities, new challenges. Maybe you're a woman who's taking on a CEO role. How do
Mhm.
you prepare yourself for taking on either something really big or something really new? What advice would you have for someone going through that?
Um, Let me just say one more thing about that
Yeah,
last question, then we go
sure.
into this. Um, I explicitly asked myself the question at different junctures about whether I would have regrets if I didn't do a thing. So,
Mm,
for
mhm,
example, when the leadership came open and Dalton Ginty stepped down, the question Jane asked me before I made the final decision was, "Will you regret not being part of the debate?" And
mm,
the answer was yes. And so, therefore, I didn't think I was going to win, but I needed to be part of the conversation. I always felt that I needed to, in order to prepare for the next big thing, is I needed to be really well prepared in an academic way,
mm,
because I never believed I was the smartest person in the room. So I needed to do the reading and do the homework and come with information that I thought would be valuable. And I guess in terms of taking on a new job, it's have I done everything I can to get me ready for this? And this is the thing women do, right? Is
mhm,
women want to be super prepared, where sometimes a man will leap into something and you think, well, how is he qualified for that? You
right.
know, and maybe not. So but I don't see that as a problem. I think that is a good thing about the way we run our lives, is that we actually want to contribute. And I think it's also a question that needs to be asked is, do you want to be something or do you want to do something? Like, do you want this role because
Mm,
you want to be it or because you want to do something? And I used to think about um, checking myself. Do I want this because I want the notoriety, like I want to be
mm,
famous, or is it
right.
because I have something that I want to do? And I think that's probably why I didn't get into it till I was a bit older.
Mm, that's a really interesting perspective, Kathleen, to think about. I'll be thinking about that long after this interview. Oh my goodness. When we talk about firsts, you were many firsts. A few would be the first female premier and openly LGBTQ premier
Mm-hmm.
in Canada,
Mm-hmm.
In Ontario. How do you handle the expectations and challenges brought on by firsts like that?
Well, when you're the first of something, what you don't have is a lot of peers around you. So there
Mm,
weren't a whole bunch of previous premiers who were women who I could
mhm.
talk to. So I
Yes.
didn't I didn't have a peer group. Happily, when I was first elected leader, there were actually six other women in the country, or five other
Mhm.
women. There were six of us who were premiers, so I actually had a chance to talk with them. But I didn't have a peer group in the same way. Um, and I also had no idea what it was like to be a premier and be a man. So I didn't have that
Mhm.
to
Yes.
compare it to, right?
Yes.
So what I found was that I carried on the way I had in my life. Um, I knew that there was misogyny and homophobia in the world because I dealt with both in my life.
Mhm.
And so I wasn't surprised that there was misogyny and homophobia in politics and in my premiership. That was
Right.
just a reality of my life. Um, did I try to use the position to make the point that those were not good things? Absolutely.
Mhm.
I tried to um, certainly as the years went on, when I was an MPP and then as premier, I tried to make sure that I took opportunities to talk with young people, to answer their questions, to
Mm.
listen to them, because I realized that I was a role model, whether I wanted to be or not. You don't get
Yes.
into a job to be a role model, but you become a role model, right?
Right.
And
Yes.
so I think as you become aware of that, then you try to use the position in the best way possible. So I remember during the Pan Am Games, there was a young athlete who came up to me and told me that the day I won the leadership of the Liberal Party was the day she came out to her parents, because she felt that if I was the premier and I was a lesbian, then her parents would more likely accept the fact that she was a lesbian. I just thought, okay,
Mm.
what's more important than that, right? And so those moments made it clear to me that I need to be out and about and listening to people and supporting them in their lives. And I tried to do that to the best of my
Tickets for our second annual Next Gen 2025 event are live. Join me and Natasha Hope Morano as we host a day of professional development and networking on February 11th, 2024 in Ottawa. Whether you're new to public affairs or seasoned pro, this event will help you advance your career. Early bird registration is open. Don't miss out. Link in show notes. Register now. How did you handle like the gender bias or when things like
Mm-hmm.
that actually came out and happened to you? How did you deal with it? Thinking about maybe in particularly advice for women who work in male dominated fields who might face similar challenges.
Yeah, I think the most important thing is in the moment to make sure that you have a sense of humor, and that
Mhm.
you are, that you push back, um, but you do it in a way. And this may be because I'm old school. I can't tell you, but I always felt that it was more important to stay in the room and be part
Mm.
of the conversation than it was to walk off in a huff. I mean, did I have fantasies about standing on the table and yelling at them all? Absolutely. But I
Yes,
just kept that in my head.
right.
And when people at the table, I'd be in a room of men, and all eyes would be on my big, burly chief of staff, and they'd be talking to him and making eye contact with him rather than with me. I just would kind of, persist and persevere and make sure that everybody knew. And he understood the dynamic. And that's the other thing, having people around me who understood and who believed in me, who
Right.
believed that I was the person who was supposed to be in that position, and that I had the right and the authority to make decisions. But in rooms full of men, there were lots of times when they didn't really believe that I had the authority to
Mm.
make the decision, that I was the right person. So you kind of have to kind of have to haul yourself up, know that it may happen. And I mean, I had little tricks, you know, and I sometimes when I'm speaking to groups of young women in leadership, I had to decide how I was going to break the ice with men, you know, because if you think about a room full of men, they will often start talking about sports, right?
Right.
That's their comfort language, right?
Yes.
And I don't watch professional sports. I do sports, but I don't watch professional sports. So, um, and I didn't feel that I had to bend to that. I mean,
Right.
I knew the general scores, and I'm a playoffs bandwagon person, right? Like I'll watch hockey when the playoffs are on. But I found that my way into a connection was often to talk about family. Everybody's got a family of one sort or
Mm-hmm.
another. So
Yeah.
whether it's a mother or whether it's kids, so I would make a connection in that way, which is not the way they would make a connection with each other. But honestly, they would talk to me about family, and then we could move on to the business. So I consciously knew that I was doing that because I didn't have that other banter, but I knew there needed to be banter. I knew there
Right.
needed to be something that happened
Right.
before the work, right?
Yes.
I also, and this may not be advice that people want to follow, but I also would say to young women, you have to learn how to swear strategically. You know,
Yeah.
you have to learn,
I love that.
you have to learn how to signal that you're not, or in my case, I felt I needed to signal that I wasn't a goody two shoes, you know, that
Mm.
I wasn't a school marm, even though maybe I looked like a school marm, maybe I looked like their aunt and they couldn't stand her, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
But that I was somebody who could take a joke, who could and like a joke and
Right.
like that kind of conversation, you know. So just things like that. Now that may sound like selling out or buying in or whatever, but it's just human connection. When I was the
Mm-hmm.
Minister of Agriculture, I made myself the Minister of Agriculture for a year when I first became Premier. And, you know, I would go to farms all around the province. And the way I was spoken to was very different than the way I would be spoken to in the city.
Yes.
But it was very familiar to me. You know, it was
Right.
people my own age or older guys calling me dear or honey or whatever. And you know, I could pretend to be offended, but I wasn't offended. And
Right.
so I didn't pretend to be offended. You know,
Right. Yes.
I thought this is a person who's talking to me in the way he talks to people from his heart. And I don't mind it. You know,
Yes.
this is part of culture. So I don't know. I think we need to be adaptable as human beings. You
Mm-hmm.
know, it's not just
Yes.
about women, but as human beings, we need to adapt and
Yes.
we need to listen not just to people's words, but to their intent. If
Mm.
someone can be really polite to me, and I had this situation just in the last few days, a young person was being really polite to me, but he was angry and there was a rude edge to what he was saying, but his
Right.
words were really perfect. And the
Mm.
reverse can be true. Somebody can sound like they're demeaning you or whatever, but actually they're just talking to you the way they would talk to a neighbor or a friend.
Right.
And so there's an element of suck it up
Yeah,
for
just
me.
not taking things so
Yeah.
personally.
Yeah.
When you talked about the sports, it's such perfect timing because I got invited to a reception last night at the American ambassador's house that was about the
Oh.
PWHL
Oh,
and
yay.
the Grit, which is like a newsletter amongst other things. And they do like summaries of sports. It's run
Oh,
by
yeah.
3 Canadian women. And I think the idea partially is that you can have these water cooler conversations about
Okay.
sports and you
Oh,
have the
that's so
summaries.
interesting.
And so that's so funny.
Oh,
So
yes, I've heard of that. Yeah, I've heard of
yeah,
that. That's
yeah.
so
So
great. Yeah.
I'll have to listen to it. They have a podcast too, so I just downloaded it yesterday. But very
But now we've
interesting.
got women's hockey to talk about. We can talk about the Scepter,
Yes.
and then there's the basketball team. You know, I
Yes.
mean, maybe more of us will have
That's
sports
true because
talk
there's
now.
more opportunities to
Exactly.
actually talk about it. Yeah, that's what
Yeah.
the ambassador is saying. He's like, now you can talk about women's sports too
Yeah.
because there's
Yeah.
more,
Yeah.
around you and more happening. But it's funny when you were talking about being in those rooms, it made me think about somebody recently asked me, I have one company and like 4 different brands that I run. So I'm pretty busy. And they say, how do you do all of that? You're so young. And I just looked at them and I said, because I'm a badass.
Yeah,
And they were like,
exactly.
okay.
Exactly.
I was like, I
Exactly.
don't know what else to tell you.
That's a perfect example. Exactly. So you could, in that moment, you could take offense because someone was being ageist,
Yes.
or you could just turn it around and, you know, judo into it and make sure that it became a really positive encounter, which you
Yeah.
did.
And then we
Yeah.
both laughed, right?
Yeah,
So yeah, it's
exactly.
funny.
I love that.
When we talk about women in politics, as you know, more than most, it can be a bit nasty and
Mm-hmm.
seems like it's getting even more volatile
Mm-hmm.
and worse today. How do we shift some of that dynamic, or like what is there to
Mm-hmm.
do?
And this really worries me. I mean, it's one thing to be in those situations where something's coming at you that's a challenge, but when we look around and we see the way people are treated, it's unacceptable. And
Yeah.
I think that we need to, as a society, we need to get really serious about how we're going to deal with social media, because it's really
Mhm.
social media that has blown this up. You know, when I ran for school trustee in 1994, there was a homophobic campaign that went on. There were pamphlets dropped, but there weren't thousands of people online saying vile, horrible things about me that young people could read, you know, and that's what's
Mm.
happening now. So I don't know the answer because I don't understand technology well enough, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah.
I mean, I have to talk to my grandkids about this, right?
Right,
And
right,
we talk about what they see online and what they're allowed to see. And their parents have not let them have cell phones really till they're in high school.
right.
And you know, I think right now what's happening in the schools where cell phones are basically being taken out of the classroom,
Yeah,
that's a good thing. You know,
right.
I think that we need to create more spaces where kids are not influenced by this stuff until they have the ability to have more of a critical eye to it. We're never going to get rid of all the nastiness. I think there are some regulations we could put in place that might fix it a bit, but it's never all going to go away. And
No.
so what we have to do is make sure that kids particularly have a
Hmm.
way to navigate it, you know, to
Yes.
understand it and to know what's true and what's not true and what's
Yeah.
appropriate and what's
And
not
what,
appropriate.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's true. There's a role for educators, but also a really important role in there for parents.
Absolutely. But
And
parents need to be educated too. You
yes,
know, I think
yes.
parents need some help, and I think the school can do this. As the cell phones are banned from the classroom and so on, I think a real push to help parents develop some skills for home, because I know that there are parents, there are parents in my own family and their circle of friends who are struggling with how to keep their kids off screens and to
Yes,
keep them
yes,
safe, you know? So
yes.
we need to support each other in this.
I have to say, so I'm in the OCDSB board,
Okay.
and we get quite a few emails from them every once in a while, different sessions and things like that that we can go to. So there are quite a lot of things accessible, if people do want to learn more, which is a
So
start
it's a
anyways.
yeah, so that is a start and that's good. But
Hmm.
you know, my putting my trustee hat on, there's a question of who's actually taking advantage of those things? Are we
Yes,
reaching the people who need to be reached?
yes, I would
Um,
agree.
you know, so the kids who really fell through the cracks in COVID were the kids
Right.
whose parents were not paying any attention, you know. So
Yes.
how do we work with that population and not paying any attention, not and that's not blaming them, but their lives are so busy or so chaotic or there's just
Yes.
stuff
And
going
both
on. They're
people
trying to put
working, right?
yeah,
Like it's like
and
we
they're
were
trying
talking
to
about
put food on the
before.
table. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. One of the things I want to ask you quickly when we were talking earlier about the dynamics online
Mm-hmm.
is how do we foster this idea of collaboration, or like people being polarized or having differences of opinion and being comfortable being uncomfortable and just moving through like I feel like we seem to be in a period right now where people don't even want to talk to people that have different views from
Yeah.
them, and
Yeah.
society doesn't really work that way. How do we move past some of that?
Well, I think wherever we are, whether it's, you know, whether we're curating an online chat or whether we are teaching a class or raising a family, we need to make space for disagreement. and
Mm-hmm.
teach each other, help kids develop the skills of feeling uncomfortable with an opinion,
Yeah.
challenging each other. I had a student come up to me uh, just in the last couple of weeks and say to me, a lot of what you've said today, I disagree with. And he said, I hope that I'm going to be able to say what I really think. And I said, that's exactly why I have said this is a nonpartisan discussion. I want differences of opinion. It's really important, particularly by the time you're in first year university, but I think way before that, where
Yes.
you learn how to debate different ideologies and different ideas. So,
Yes.
so I think that it is our responsibility in all of our lives
Mm-hmm.
to not shy away from that kind of conflict, because conflict can be productive. And if kids don't learn how to disagree with one another,
Yes.
then we end up with people who only know how to yell at each other. And that's
Right.
what we're seeing right now.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a very important point. I want to ask you before we do the rapid fire questions, which should be
Mm-hmm.
really quick, is what what are you passionate about right now? Like what issues are driving you?
Oh, there's so many things. It's what's driving me right now. So the reason I'm involved with a board um, that provides support for wellness for Indigenous kids is that I think that the central issue for this country, in terms of our ability to progress as a nation, socially, economically, is the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people.
Mm-hmm.
Because that is about the story we tell ourselves about our history, right? It's
Mm,
it's who we are as a country, and so that issue really drives me. And I try to find ways to open up conversation about that wherever I can. So in the course that I teach, I have the students read a book by Tanya Talaga called All Our
mm,
Relations, and I
yeah.
and I try to promote that kind of self-education wherever I can. So I'd say that's a pretty core issue. But honestly, from day to day, I can get involved, I can get worked up about a whole number of things.
Yes, yes. I'm
you
sure,
know,
especially being a premier, right? Because you end up on so many issues and being passionate about so many issues. So,
So I do a little radio piece once a week on talk radio in Toronto, and it's stuff that's working and stuff that's not. And so this morning I just kept there were just subjects coming and coming. Like there's the subject of the number of kids who are dying in child welfare right now.
mm,
There's the issue right now about safe injection sites and the fact that the province is shut is going to mean people are going to die. I was very excited about the PWHL name. Like there's so many things that
right.
can get me worked up. And you know what? That's a good thing. I'm going to hold
Yeah,
on to that
that's
as
why
long as
it
I
makes
can.
you a good premier, right? Is to be so passionate about so many things. All right. So in rapid fire, I want to ask you, can you name a rule that you broke that turned out to be a great decision?
I think coming out as a lesbian was that was a big societal
That's a
rule.
pretty big one.
It was a big one.
Right.
Turned out to be a great idea. Yeah.
Who's a woman who continually inspires you?
You know, I I've been asked that question a lot, and there are people like Nellie McClung and Agnes MacPhail who were early female politicians in the country. But honestly, when I draw on strength and I need strength, it's my grandmother I go to.
Mm,
Her name was Eva Crummer. She started teaching in on Northern Ontario in 1907. And she was my hero. So it's like I hear her voice a lot.
I
Yeah.
love that. What's one book that has significantly impacted your wisdom or perspective?
Oh my gosh, the one book, one movie question. It's so hard. It's so hard. So I've got a whole list of books that but I would say, let me just talk about an old one and a new one. I think a book like Margaret Lawrence's Stone Angel, when I was young,
Okay.
it was such a beautifully written book, and it allowed me to hear a voice of an older person in a different way, because the
Mm,
story is told from inside her head.
ah,
And so that really changed my perspective. And a recent book, I was just I was just actually on the jury that selected this book for the Shaughnessy Cohen Book Award. It's called Fire Weather by John Valiant, Villant, and it changed my perspective on Alberta. And
Okay.
because it's about the 2016 fires in Fort McMurray. So it is about fire, it's about climate change, but it's also about the culture in Alberta and the oil and gas industry and Fort McMurray in particular. So I recommend that. And it was a profound experience reading that book.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Thank you so much for sharing your time with me.
You're very welcome. Thank you for your questions and your interest. And I wish you all the best. You take care of yourself.
Thanks for joining us on Women Don't Do That. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating or review. Connect with us on Instagram at Women Don't Do That and visit our website www.womendon'tdothat.com for more details. Join our Patreon to support our work. Find all of the links in the show notes. Remember, you have the power to transform your what ifs into let's go. Together, let's redefine your possible. Until next time. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of Women Don't Do That, Stephanie Mitton, or affiliated brands.